How's it going? I'm Brian Beck. I'm with NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program, and I understand you have a lot of talks you can choose from, so I appreciate that you found our little speakeasy around the corner here and going to hear me talk about something, and I don't think I have a single graph in any of my slides. This is high-level task force working group stuff, so obviously it's going to be super thrilling, and so I'm just going to give a quick overview of the task force and talk about the restoration working group and what we've been doing. I want to recognize my co-authors. So Kristine Bucchianeri, she used to be the AIC Executive Director. She's moved on and now works with NOAA's Pacific Island Regional Office, and she has been kind of the glue that's held the task force and the restoration working group together. And then my co-chair, that lady there on the bottom, a few people recognize, Joanna. She works for Florida DEP. She is a workhorse, and a lot of people are really anxious for her to come back from maternity leave. So for those of you who don't know, the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force was established in 1998 by President Clinton as an executive order to get federal agencies and jurisdictions together to protect coral reefs. When I say jurisdictions, there are 7 U.S. coral jurisdictions. They're on the map here, going from west to east. You have CNMI, Guam, Hawaii, American Samoa, Florida, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. And so here's a list of all the member groups. The co-chairs are NOAA through the Department of Commerce and the U.S. Department of Interior. There's about another dozen federal agency members, and then again, those 7 state and territory members and the freely associated states. I might also say the All Islands Committee, or the AIC, and that's just another way sort of referring to the group that represents those 7 U.S. coral reef jurisdictions. The task force meets in person twice a year. In the spring, we have a meeting in the D.C. area, and then in the fall, we have one in the jurisdictions that alternates between basins. And the main group that keeps this body going is there's a steering committee made up of representatives from a lot of these agencies, but then when it comes to the products and materials that come out of the task force, that's typically done by the working groups, and there are 7 fairly active working groups. The first is the climate change working group. They're charged with fixing climate change, and not really, it would be nice, but they kind of make sure that climate change adaptation is incorporated into all of the products and materials that the rest of the working groups are putting out. They also help support vulnerability assessments, climate risks, things like that in the jurisdictions. The Watershed Working Group works with land-based sources of pollution, helping to reduce those. They have priority watersheds they focus on, and the big news for them was that one of their priority watersheds just graduated and moved out of the priority status, Fanga'alu in American Samoa. It was great because it was a smaller watershed. It had a very easily identifiable problem, and everyone was very happy at our last meeting to have a little graduation party. It had everything except for the sheet cake. It was great. The Enforcement Working Group is run by the Department of Justice. They lead that. It's had different levels of activity. In the past, it's focused a lot on training and capacity building. It's kind of ramping back up again, so it'll be interesting to see which direction that goes. Coral Disease Working Group, Carolyn McLaughlin and Dana work a lot on that one, and you've probably heard about Stony Coral Tissue Loss Disease Implementation Plan that's just coming out, and that's a big effort for that group. And while they're focused on Stony Coral Tissue Loss Disease, it's setting the groundwork for, if there, heaven forbid, is another disease outbreak in the future, all this work can be leveraged off of for a quicker response, quicker monitoring. The Fisheries and Ecosystem Management Working Group, that's a new one. They are gathering information from all 7 of the jurisdictions to help them develop sustainable fishery plans. The Communications Working Group has changed from what used to be education and outreach to help put out information about the task force. Again, all the products that are being developed from the different working groups, they can help communicate those better. And then there's that Restoration Working Group, those pesky kids. So raise a hand if you're on some restoration working group. Right. There's a lot of us. There's a lot of restoration working groups out there that do a lot of different things. So what we try to do is focus at the level that's most effective for us. So it's an interagency working group, high-level managers in the jurisdiction. So we're focusing a lot on permitting and planning to see what we can do to facilitate that to make it easier for folks. So some of the past efforts, again, a lot of these are very familiar things that we have seen many times today. So the All Islands Committee came, they're members of the task force, and they said, hey, we need assistance with restoration planning. That was the impetus that started the ball rolling for the manager's guide for coral reef restoration planning and design. And as we've heard from a lot of the TNC folks and other people, this has been utilized now, and it was developed with help from the task force. And it was key in a lot of the Pacific restoration planning that went on. So now we have draft plans for at least one goal for all 4 of the jurisdictions in the Pacific. And then the Restoration Working Group also really helped review and push forward the Coral Reef Restoration for Risk Reduction, or CR4. And that at our past meeting was also just adopted as an official task force document, so that is also very good. So currently we're focusing on sort of 4 big themes. There's planning, research, permitting, and funding. I remembered them all. So with planning, again, we supported the Pacific restoration planning, and we're currently helping with the Atlantic planning, especially helping wrap up what's being done in USVI that Leslie talked about. We're kicking off efforts in Puerto Rico. We're keeping tabs on Florida, but they have really got the ball going there. And as much as we can, we coordinate with the CRC Management Working Group to make sure that we're not duplicating any effort, to make sure like what they're doing, we're not reinventing the same wheel. With research, we're not too involved with research, but what we want to do is highlight research needs in the jurisdictions. We do bring in some speakers at times to talk about innovation, to make people more aware of it. We had Scott McDonald from Sea Foundry give a presentation about his automations for ex situ nurseries that we thought was very interesting. And then a big one that I'll talk a little bit more about is permitting. It's a pain in the butt for everyone, and so some people just don't even know where to start. So we're developing a permitting guidance document that I'll talk about. And then also we want to try to see what we can do to streamline it. I don't think you can streamline permitting, but where we can make things more efficient, move smoother, we're going to try to look into that. And then funding, we have the CR4 guide, but then also we're trying to facilitate discussions for reef insurance. We had TNC help walk us through this a little bit at the Kona meeting, and it is great, and there's a lot of interest in some of the jurisdictions about getting a similar program going for them. So the permitting guidance document, this graph is permitting, and is a very simplified version of permitting in the United States for restoration. This effort started as Jen Moore helped me create a spreadsheet that was simply what activity are you doing and what waters are you doing it in, and then the cells were filled out with what agency you need to get a permit from. That got handed over to a great group of students at the University of Washington, who then turned it into a 50-plus page document that was simply emails, links to agencies, phone numbers, basically all of the different contacts for that permitting. And so now we have that, and we're working on getting that reviewed to make sure all that information is correct. What we also don't want to do is duplicate what other agencies have done. A lot of agencies have already sort of gone through this effort of making a guide, and we're just going to incorporate that in and link to it. We just want to make sure that this can sort of be the first stop for a lot of this information, and we're going to try to update it regularly, make sure the contacts still work, the phone numbers aren't disconnected, the links aren't broken. And we're hoping to get that done within the next year. And one of the last things I want to talk about is we just had an in-person meeting for the task force, which was great. The Restoration Working Group was able to have a full-day meeting. The morning was in conjunction with the Climate Change Working Group. But the morning, again, was all about reef insurance, and they walked through this guide. We had breakouts where we talked about some of their 6 steps in there. It's a little more efficient than Kurt's 12-step program. And walking through some of those and things you need to consider, what threats can be measured so they can be applied for reef insurance. We had DARPA give a great overview of reef fence, again, like we heard here. And then Ben Jones from the Hawaii team gave a detailed presentation on what they're going on. And again, this is something everyone is super interested in, and I'm hoping I can have at least once a year reef fence come back to give updates on what's going on. And then we heard the restoration goals, like we heard from a couple folks earlier today, from the 7 jurisdictions and what their needs are, their capacity gaps. And so moving forward with the restoration working group, permitting is sort of going to be key. So we're going to hopefully be able to roll out that permitting guidance document at the DC meeting, which is in this coming spring. And then we want to identify the bottlenecks. Some people were brave enough to hold up their hands from agencies and say, we are the bottleneck. And they said, we know it, and we just struggle to address it for these reasons. So working with those groups to be like, okay, what can we do to help with this? Is it, funding for capacity to hire another person to just simply review permits? Is it working with jurisdictions on what they need to do to get programmatic permits so they can do activities under an umbrella permit? And so we're going to be updating the membership a little bit, making sure we're targeting people from each of the jurisdictions, especially those who have permitting experience. So if you or a friend is affected by restoration permitting, please reach out to me. And if you want to be involved in the working group, you don't have to be a member of a federal agency. You can be academic, you can be NGO, all are welcome. Especially if you can help with the restoration permitting document, that would be great. And in signing up, you can find my email right there. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. We do have a minute for a question, if anyone has any questions.
Yeah. Say that again. Mm-hmm. It's going to be mainly in situ. We will add ex situ as we can, where it makes sense. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? We could take one more. Go ahead.
No.
Is that multiple levels, like state, federal, local?
Yeah, so that's just, it's all broken down. So you start here and you go, okay, this is the jurisdiction. I'm working in federal waters. I'm building a structure, so I'm going to need my Army Corps. And I'm working with threatened species, so I need to go through this process. So yeah, it's going to break it down for all those activities. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Brian.